Welcome to Restore the Glory podcast. My name is Jake Khym.
And I'm Bob Schuchts.
We're two Catholic therapists sharing what we've learned personally and professionally to help you on the journey of restoration. If you've been blessed by our podcast, please prayerfully consider partnering with us on Patreon. Your support will help cover the cost to produce the podcast, but will also give you access to exclusive content like monthly reflections and special live stream teachings. Go to patreon.com/restoretheglory and join the mission of experiencing the restoration of our God-given glory. Hey, Bob, good to be back with you again. I have to say that we have a guest today that might be, and my listeners are going to go, oh, here he goes again, but might be my most excited guest of all time. And let me explain for a few brief moments why. When I'm working on my own interior life, one of the most consistent analogies that I use is parts. There's a part of me that feels this and a part of me that feels that. And we have a guest, Dr. Peter Malinowski, who in my mind is the Catholic expert. And so, Dr. Peter, welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited to have you on. Thanks for being with us.
Jake, Bob, it is an honor to be with you here on Restore the Glory. Thank you so much for having me.
There are so many places, listeners, that you can go and find. I just want to let you know, because you might go, oh, I've heard of this guy. Let me stop this episode and go listen to him talk in his own podcast. So, Peter, tell us about where can people find out about you? We'll repeat it at the end, and then we're going to get into all this. So you have a podcast of your own. You got websites. Tell us about where people can find you.
So the main site is Souls and Hearts, and that's at soulsandhearts.com. If you're interested in my podcast, it's a long-form solo cast, and that is Interior Integration for Catholics, and it's on all the major podcast platforms. I also do a weekly reflection that's written. It's emailed. You can also find it in our archive at soulsandhearts.com/blog.
Very cool. Okay. I've listened to the podcast repeatedly. I have people that I actually accompany who listened to the podcast and have found it very helpful and have brought it into my discussions with them. So, Peter, this is awesome. I'm going to kick us off, and then Bob and I will kind of go back and forth. When we talk about parts, and it's kind of common language. Oh, a part of me wants to go out, a part of me doesn't. Mm-hmm. What do we mean by parts? And is that Catholic? How does that work?
So, this is something that comes up so much. This question of, is it Catholic? Is it Catholic to think along the lines of parts? Isn't that fragmenting? Right. Isn't that somehow, and in our Western culture, we've become very imbued with this idea of a single, unitary, homogeneous personality. That there's just sort of one me, and it's uniform, it's homogeneous, it's monolithic. And I challenge that. And I think I've got good grounds for doing that in everything from the image of God, or who God is, through Scripture, through the early church fathers, through the Catechism of the Catholic Church, through St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine. So there's a whole realm of various converging lines of evidence to suggest that we can get beyond the limiting strictures of thinking of ourselves as being just one homogeneous being. Huh. And it's so striking because I'm the third reader on a dissertation by Christian Amalou, who is at Divine Mercy University, titled An Analysis of Internal Family Systems, Therapeutic Factors from the Perspective of the Catholic Christian Metamodel of the Person. He's looking at this for his doctoral dissertation. I'm on that dissertation committee, and it's been a great ride. So
very cool. Okay, gosh, all right. We'll have to put the link. Maybe, I don't know if that'll be somewhere on Google Scholar or whatnot. But anyway, okay. Yeah,
that's awesome. One of my favorite quotes that I ran into related to that. It's under the section in Life in Christ that talks about the integrity of the person, and it's a quote from St. Augustine. He says, indeed, it is through chastity, purity of heart, purity of body, that we are gathered together and led back to the unity from which we were fragmented into multiplicity. So right there, recognition. Wow. And St. Paul says, I don't do what I want to do. I do the thing that I hate. It's not me that does it. It's there's this recognition of, even though we're called to unity, there's a fragmentation in us, and otherwise we wouldn't need healing. If we were all in total integration, we wouldn't need healing, right?
Absolutely. And that quote that you gave from St. Augustine was brought into the Catechism as paragraph 2340. It's
Right.
not just, kind of
Yep.
his writings. It's been brought into the official teaching of the church.
Wow.
So, so many different ways that we can look at this. And St. Paul's quote in Romans 7:15, why is it that I do that which I don't want to do? And you can see he's struggling with this tension inside. But I think the strongest evidence that we have parts, or that we have a multiplicity of ourself, of the self, comes from our Lord himself. In the second great commandment, when he says, love your neighbor as yourself. Right there, he's telling us you have to love yourself. You have to have a relationship with yourself. And then, he goes on to say, upon these two commandments hang the law and the prophets, all the law and the prophets. This is really important.
No kidding.
So this idea of, okay, how do we love ourselves so that we can love our neighbor better? How do we relate with ourselves? That's what's driven my entire career as a psychologist. That right there pinpoints what I'm passionate about as a Catholic psychologist. So,
wow. So what is it like when you're talking about a multiplicity of selves? Like the trained therapist might be thinking, are we talking about dissociative identity disorder? And the layperson might be going, what? I have multiple parts of me. Do I need to go to the ER? Like, what does that mean? Or and how do we make sense of still remaining a whole? And how is this not a disorder? Like, how do we make sense of this, Peter?
So let's think about a jazz band.
Okay.
A jazz band. A jazz band is a unity, right? There's one jazz band, but it's also a multiplicity. There are multiple musicians within the jazz band. Okay, so something can be both a unity and a multiplicity. We have that in our God, right? We have God as one in three persons, right? A unity and a multiplicity. And we're made in his image and likeness. So the whole idea that we can be both one and multiple, we've got a long tradition of that. There's nothing sort of intrinsically problematic with that. In fact, we wouldn't be able to love ourselves if we were a single homogeneous entity with no sort of dynamism or variability inside. So we'll just start with the idea of like multiplicity is okay. That's it. But your second question, your bigger question maybe is, what does a part look like?
Yeah, let's go there.
So it depends on who you talk to. Okay. It depends on who you talk to. I'm trained in internal family systems, which was originated by Richard Schuchts. He has a definition of a part that would go beyond what I would say a part is. Okay. So but we can start with that. And basically he says it's like a little separate person inside you, like a separate personality with its own feelings and thoughts and ideas and assumptions, its own way of relating, its own sense of identity, its own memory. He goes so far as to say that each part has its own self. It has its own body.
Whoa.
There's a very expansive definition of what a part is.
Okay.
And so I don't hold to that, but I do hold that there are these constellations of thoughts and feelings, of perceptions, of access to memories that hold together and that perdure, they last over time, even if they're not in conscious awareness. And so you can think of them as modes of operating, if that's more helpful. You can think of them as personalities within. They have different degrees of access to different faculties, I believe, inside, like the will or the intellect or memory. So we're still really working hard to kind of come to an anthropological understanding of what exactly a part is. But what I can say is that when you begin to work with these, either clinically or within your own life, it makes things so much clearer as far as like what's happening inside. To be able to say a part of me is angry at God somehow seems so much safer than to say I'm angry at God. right? For
Yes.
example.
Yes.
Yeah, there's good stuff. My mind's going lots of different
Yeah, me
directions.
too.
So that a dissociative identity disorder is just an extreme end of the continuum. So multiplicity, according to the way that I think about this and the way that a lot of, especially trauma therapists are thinking about it because of the fragmenting effects
Yep.
of trauma,
Yep.
that's just one extreme end of a continuum. So to have these parts or to have these constellations or these modes of operating, that's normal,
Yes.
even if we don't think about it that way. So,
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. Years ago, I worked with people with severe multiplicity, and doing that work really helped to recognize that multiplicity in every one of us, even though it's not extreme dissociation, but it's there in all of us. And, you use the example of the Trinity, and their multiplicity is in complete unity because there's no sin, there's no separation, there's no lack of love. But within each of us, you could say, and between us with other persons. And I think sometimes the lack of integration within us is a reflection of the lack of integration in our relationships outside of us because of sin. And so I think we all can understand that connection, right? Is that, there are places in me that aren't in perfect unity.
Yeah.
There are thoughts that aren't in perfect unity with my feelings. There are stages of my life that I'm stuck in trauma that aren't fully in union with my will or with my adult self. And so I think it just makes common sense once you start looking at it and seeing it in relation to the way we struggle. So I would like to take a step back and just ask the question of, how did you get involved in this? Tell us a little bit about your background, your history, how you got interested.
Sure. So, I became a psychologist in part to try to work through my own issues, as so many of us do, and was really dissatisfied with what I was getting in graduate school. In fact, I almost dropped out of the field because I was really looking for a way to harmonize the practice of psychology grounded in a Catholic understanding of the human person. I really wanted that. And so I was trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, and I just didn't find that to be enough to deal with the intensity of the symptom presentations I was seeing. And so got into eventually health and rehab psychology, then got into psychoanalytic psychology, which was much more helpful, more of a depth psychology. But as I worked with a lot of trauma, in traumatized individuals, especially complex trauma, I got into EMDR, and then I got into working in parts within EMDR, Sandra Paulson's work, that was based off of Helen and Jack Watkins' ego state therapies. And I thought, this is parts. I'm dealing with parts. I have to deal with parts.
Yeah.
And then I started discovering parts within me. And then I thought to myself, okay, I've got to really understand, because I've got parts that have to understand, like really want to get into the theory of this, right? So I looked at a bunch of different models of therapy that looked at parts, developmental needs meeting strategies, schema mode therapy. I looked at the structural theory of dissociation. There were a number of them that are out there that take a look at parts, but I chose IFS because it had both the emphasis on the unity and the multiplicity. Both of them. And there was this concept of the self too, this active inner leader that had the capacity to help organize, what was going on inside the person. So it seemed very, very appealing and very harmonizable with the Catholic faith. So that's sort of in a nutshell. So I went and got, level 1 training, level 2 training, level 3 training, IFIO training, which is the couples and marital training, and continued to get a lot of sort of background in that. And then I was able to bring it to the Catholic world and really be thinking about that with 80 other therapists in the interior therapist community. There are 80 or so Catholic therapists that are working on their own human formation with IFS with me there. And so that's just been a huge, fruitful endeavor in terms of being able to kind of explore these questions of, who are we? Who are we as beloved sons and daughters of God? What in our human formation is getting in the way of that? The fragmenting effects of trauma, the fragmenting effects of sin. And so it was just a perfect marriage of the natural and the spiritual.
Yeah.
What is this that you just mentioned? Because we have a lot of therapists that listen, and they sure might be interested in that. I know that sure piqued my interest. What did you just describe? What is this?
Sure. So one of the communities within Souls and Hearts is the Interior Therapist community. And that is a community of about 80, 90 Catholic therapists that want to work on their own human formation.
Wow.
And so the focus of that is not to learn internal family systems, but it's to apply internal family systems to their own selves. Because I do a lot of consultation and supervision, and when a therapist gets stuck in therapy and it's agitating and they're worked up about it, it's always something getting activated in the therapist's self. It's something going on within the therapist, not the client. And so often when we consult on those cases, we're looking at the client, we're looking at the client's background, the client's history, what the client's doing, what they're not doing, what the transferences are, what the defenses are, what the resistances are, all that stuff. Client. It's not the client. It's the therapist.
Wow.
Yep.
And so what I do is I bring it home to what's going on, what's getting activated in the therapist, because anything a therapist can't tolerate in himself or herself, that therapist won't be able to tolerate in a client. It'll activate too much of their own stuff. And so we need to remove the beam from our own eye. We really need to settle in and be in touch with our own system. Therapists have to be pretty integrated in order to be able to be available to their clients, in order to be able to love their clients in the way that the role of therapist pulls for.
Yeah. I know that's sure been my experience as a therapist, that I say to people, if you want to be a saint, become a therapist. Now that's kind of a catchphrase, but basically what it means is it will demand such a high level of integration. It's one of the fastest ways to be exposed, one of the fastest ways to realize how broken you are when you're trying to love well. And boy, has that been my experience. And I think for those our listeners who aren't therapists, is it fair to say, Peter, that the bridge goes there too? Because in therapy, it's a high level of care and attentiveness to the other, which it stresses the system. And so if there's a part of you that's like, I'm not getting what I need, and then that part of me starts freaking out, that also happens in everyday life too. Is that fair to say? So yeah.
Sure. Well, our Lord in his providential love for us is going to give us exactly the situations that will pull for what needs healing. Romans 8:28, right? All things work together for good for those who love the Lord, called to according to his decree. So whatever challenges we're facing, if we are oriented toward loving the Lord, in our innermost core, we're going to get exactly the types of things that we need to work that are going to bring out what we need to work on. So yeah, it happens on the other end of the therapy in terms of the client role. What I get concerned about though is that too often clients get blamed for therapist shortcomings, and that can be really harmful. So that's what we work on in the ITC, in the interior therapist community. But yeah, I think there's so many opportunities in our lives to actually do this work or not do the work. Therapy can be a very safe endeavor, very shallow, very superficial, or it can be something that's incredibly deep.
Yeah.
So it depends a lot on what the nature of the relationship between the therapist and the client is. And that depends on the degree of integration in the therapist and the client. That's straight out of St. Thomas Aquinas. You have to have inner unity, interior integration, before you can have union.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. So let me take this to the next level. I I found out about you through some very faithful Catholics who are part of your groups that are doing this work together. Can you talk a little bit about that, about the groups that you have? And
Sure. So that's a different community within Souls and Hearts. That's the Resilient Catholics community. And so in the pandemic, and it's so interesting because within a week, I started Interior Integration for Catholics and you guys started Restore the Glory. We started these podcasts within a week of each other in March of 2020.
That's amazing.
And so, so there's a little interesting point of connection there. But I started the podcast. I started to talk about parts. I started to talk about how do we ground human formation in a Catholic anthropology? How do we bring it outside of just therapy? Because I don't believe that therapy or counseling has a monopoly on human formation whatsoever. whatsoever. We really, and you know that, Bob. I mean, you're doing all kinds of things in the, John Paul II, the Healing Center, that aren't therapy, right? And the accompaniment stuff, Jake, that you're talking about, that's not therapy. That's not counseling. There's other ways to do this. And in fact, it starts even before this human formation starts before birth. It starts in the home, right? Parents and so forth. So how can we really bring the best of human formation resources, the best of psychology to people? I started the podcast, Interior Integration for Catholics, but then a community started to form around it. People asking me questions, people wanting to get together. And that grew eventually into the Resilient Catholics community, which is a focus on being informed by internal family systems, but grounded in the truths of divine revelation from our church. We always harmonize the human formation psychology stuff with what we know to be true by divine, by divine revelation, not the other way around.
Yes.
And how do we empower people to work together in small groups to be able to go on this pilgrimage toward better human formation? That's our little corner of the vineyard, is that so many spiritual problems that people have are consequences of human formation deficits. In other words, if you have a terrible relationship with your father, for example, just on the natural level, there wasn't attunement, there wasn't love, there wasn't much of a relationship, there's trauma there, it's going to be very difficult to relate to God as Father.
Yes.
Right? That's going to be a toxic kind of idea or concept experientially for you. Even if in your head, that God is a loving Father, there's going to be in your bones these parts that have a very different experience of Father. Yeah. And so how do we work through these things in a way that doesn't require therapy, that doesn't require counseling, that allows us to care for ourselves and to love ourselves from our innermost self loving our parts? Because not even a therapist can do that for you. A therapist can't love you in lieu of you. Not even God can love you in lieu of you, in your place. You actually have to love you.
Wow.
So that's what the focus is. I think of it as doing sort of the arithmetic, shoring up that natural foundation for the spiritual life, shoring up that natural foundation. St. Thomas Aquinas says that grace perfects nature. It has to have nature to perfect. And so I'm working before the spiritual life, kind of like the way that you would raise a baby, right? Of course you baptize the baby, but you also form the baby in a human way. Yeah. And that's what we haven't stayed up with enough. We haven't done enough on that human formation. So it's an attempt to try to hit that need. And so we've got about 130 people in the RCC right now. Wow. There's a year-long program, 44 weeks. I do an interconnection talk. It's a lot of experiential exercises. We've got a library of hundreds of experiential exercises that we do to help people with this interior integration to be able to, in the end, better love God and better love their neighbor, right? The two great commandments. Yeah. That's really what it's all about, being able to carry those out. That's why St. John the Baptist is our patron, because he prepared the way for the Lord.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. That is so I would just say, listeners, pause and go back and listen to that last 5 minutes. There is so much that's there that I think is foundational, that I know Peter, Bob, and I are in complete alignment with you on it. I'm internally going, oh yes, yes. This is one of the reasons that we started this podcast, was because and I'll say it this way, I know what you're talking about personally. Mm-hmm. I know the stuff that's come up for me as a therapist that has been my stuff and negatively affected clients. And this is my world and my life. And I see it professionally, where when push comes to shove and I'm like, I have no idea how to help this person, I naturally go to parts work. And so could we, Peter, take another step and say, how does somebody even begin this process of integrating a part? What the heck does that even mean? How do you even start it? And does it start with just self-awareness? And then if I know I have what do I do next? Where do we go?
So I could answer that technically, or I could answer that more in terms of the principles. Okay. So which way would you like me to go first?
Whatever way your heart desires.
It comes down to you as your innermost self loving your part. I mean, if you want to sum it up, it's about you loving that part. So much of the time, we're rejecting parts of ourselves. In fact, I'll go so far as to say, because I believe it to be true, I've seen this, that so many cases of suspected demon possession are really the person hating a part of themselves and literally demonizing a part of themselves.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So there you have a clear example of an extreme self-condemnation, right? This part of me is not a part of me. It's so evil. It's so wrong. It's so bad. It's so dangerous that I want it to be exorcised out of me.
Wow.
Okay. So that's an extreme, but we all have parts of ourselves. Saint Paul talks about this in Romans 7:15. Why is it that I do that I don't want to do? Right. Or there's another example too, in St. James. He says those conflicts, this is James 4, verse 1, those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you?
Yeah.
Wow. So what we need to do is understand that this is Thomas Aquinas too. These parts of us have good intentions. They're trying to help. But so often, because of a very limited perspective, they're caught back in time. They're very young. They don't have a broad vision. They have a very narrow vision. They have a very narrow mission, an agenda that they're trying to pursue. They often use harmful means. And means that would be sinful if the will endorsed them and carried them out within the person, if you sanction them and carried them out. But to understand that they're trying to help. So the first thing is to form a relationship with your parts. You as the innermost self, you as that inner leader, the one that has the vision, the one that is, I argue, has the graces to be able to reach out to the parts of yourself. Wow. So that's what we're looking for broadly, conceptually. Mm-hmm. How you do that in practice is very experiential. Let me say this first. You cannot read or study your way there. You cannot just get it in your head and expect that that's going to translate into your bones, into the fibers of your being. I think of these parts as being parts of us, right? Our Lord said in that first great commandment, I go back to them over and over again, to love the Lord your God with your whole heart. That's all of you, all your parts, no part left behind, right? So the first thing is to stop demonizing them, stop condemning them, stop trying to suppress them, to exile them, to banish them. So many people are playing whack-a-mole with their parts, and that's parts of them that are doing that too. That's not their innermost selves. That's just protectors that are trying to keep them safe from temptations, from impulses, from being drawn to things that would be harmful. To recognize that all of these parts of you have good intentions that are all trying to help. That would be the first step.
Wow. Yeah. Can I throw in a personal experience, and then you can draw it out as a description of the work? So when I started therapy, my therapist asked me to bring pictures in. This is maybe 35 years ago. And one of the pictures I brought in was me it was my, I think 12th birthday or 13th birthday. And I was in that awkward stage, but my dad had just left. And it was my grandfather handing me 13 strawberries with $13 bills underneath it. But I looked at that picture and I didn't like that me at all. Mm-hmm. I didn't like my hair. I didn't like my body posture, the look on my face. And I didn't know that I was projecting the pain, rejecting that part of me because of the pain that was there. As before I started doing that work with the pain that was there. So it was focused on my body. John Paul II talks about the body becomes the scapegoat for our shame, right?
Right.
So I was focused on my hair and my, my hunched shoulders and everything else. But it was beautiful over the years, and it wasn't quick. But it was beautiful over the years, just the therapist loving that part of me before I could love that part of me, and then encouraging me to, what do I don't like about it, which led me into the pain. So can you talk about the process there from the standpoint of internal family systems?
Sure. So what internal family systems presents is that parts become burdened. They become burdened in a way. They take on burdens, and they do this to keep us from being overwhelmed by the intensity of the experience. And so burdens could be of shame or of grief or of sadness or loss or fear, right? And they carry these burdens because if that were to be let loose within the system, uncontained, we would not survive. We would not be able to function. And so these parts that are carrying the intensity of these burdens, the grief, the shame, the loss, the anger, they're doing us a great service. They're actually sacrificing themselves so that we can live. And in reward, they get punished inside of us by other parts that are so threatened by that shame or by that anger or by that sadness or by that grief or whatever it is, that they suppress them. And there's a reason they do it, because those parts do want to be liberated from that. They do want to be free. They do want to be integrated. They don't want to be isolated. They don't want to be fragmented off. So they are trying to somehow be freed from that burden. And when there's a hope that could happen, they come to the surface. Or sometimes when the desperation is so great, they come to the surface. And so what IFS says, what internal family systems says, is that these parts can be unburdened. In other words, the part is not the burden. The part is not the anger. The part is not the shame. The part is not the grief. The part is not the burden. The part can let go of that burden if the conditions are right. If there is a sense that there is a secure attachment figure, and IFS really emphasizes the importance of the innermost self loving that part, right? Which frees the part to be able to let go of that. And then all the other parts who are burdened by protecting against this part or protecting this part from being hurt further or whatever, can be freed from their burdens of the roles that they're in. These protective roles of trying to stifle that part or suppress the part or make sure that nobody ever comes into contact with that part. So it's a process of unburdening that becomes central, but there's also a process of unblending, just getting that part not to either be too isolated from the self so there can be no relationship, or taking over the self, because that's sort of where parts tend to go. They either take over, and they drive the bus, and they don't have the gifts to be able to drive the bus. It's like little kids driving a bus, or they are remote. They cannot be accessed. And so what we work on is, how can we enter into a relationship with these parts that's cooperative, collaborative, harmonious, more integrated, so that sets the stage for us to then be able to do the unburdening. So unblending first, and that is being in right relationship with the part, even though the part still has the burden, and then the unburdening.
Yeah, as you were describing that about how that part takes on the burden, I was hearing Jesus. It's like they become, he takes on our shame, he takes on our pain, because and yet it becomes a false Messiah in a certain sense. I mean, it's there necessary in terms of our survival, but part of the healing is Jesus saying, "Come to me, all you are heavily burdened, and I will give you." Like, right, we bring those places where we've been our savior out of survival and bring that to Jesus. Is that
I think that's a beautiful way to look at it. If you look at who Jesus reached out to, he reached out to the lepers, to the tax collectors, to the lost sheep, right? To the outcasts, the ones that were blind and lame and carrying burdens of different kinds. I argue that it's the same kind of thing taken inside, right? That's a model for us to be able to reach out to these parts of us that are our lepers and tax collectors and prostitutes and Pharisees. Right. But there has to be something inside of us that can organize and can somehow direct or guide ourselves toward Jesus.
Yeah.
Something inside of us that has to direct or guide ourselves toward Jesus. He doesn't want to come in and do it for us because that would be invasive.
Yeah.
That would violate our dignity. And so I do believe we do have this innermost self, and you hear about this in the catechism. We hear about this when we talk about the heart. And I know, Bob, you've done so much work around the heart. You know these catechism passages probably a lot better than I do. But the idea that, there is a way for that to happen. And then that innermost self can be the bridge, can be the conduit, the connection between the parts and God.
Yeah.
Because each of these parts has an image of God. Each of these parts has an understanding of God, and any part that's not in right relationship with the self is going to have a heretical understanding of God.
Wow. Peter, let me run by you a way that I've tried to integrate or make sense of this or work with this, and tell me what you think and maybe some other way or improvements or whatever. So I've likened this to pick a setting that can have multiple seats and imagine it. So my image is, for some reason, it's a boardroom. So there's a big table and multiple chairs, and then there's the chair at the head of the table, which implies an authority, but it's kind of the leader of the room. Now, this could be it could be a dinner table, it could be a picnic table, but for some reason, it's always a table for me. And how I do this work, and please comment, is at the head of the table are two chairs in my mind. One is for my true self and the other is for Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And then around the table are multiple parts of me.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is I'm pretty visual and imaginative, and there's at times what feels like a part that's just like spinning in his chair, and he's like, I don't care, this is stupid. There's another part who's like heads down on the table, like, I hate this. There's a part that's maybe out of his chair in the corner who feels like, I don't want to be here, this is terrible. And so then what I try to do is to the best I can, who's upset, what's going on, can we all come and try to talk? And then I'm trying to like manage a group in a sense of going, okay, hold on, they get to talk first, and let's all do basic listening skills. And I've actually taken it so far as to say there's like things on the wall, and I call it posters on the wall. And the posters on the wall have these phrases that are like deep, deep beliefs, and they might not be true. They might be lies, but they're just there on the wall. And we all kind of glance at it and go, gosh, that sure feels true. Like, I'm not good enough. Or maybe there's a positive one of, maybe a part goes, Jesus loves me. That's on my section of the wall, and I love that, and that's true. Another part goes, that's baloney. He doesn't. And so is that a reasonable way to get into this? And what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's a basic parts informed way to do it. And that's the way a lot of therapists will work who are interested in parts. I think there are some nuances that can make it so much more effective, though.
Awesome. Please.
And the first is to actually not have Jesus there.
Oh.
The first is to not have Jesus there, because so many parts are terrified of Jesus.
Wow.
So many parts are so frightened that they could not ever approach the table.
Interesting.
And so this is where I found some of the concepts from Sherry Waddell in her, this whole idea of pre-evangelization, taken inside, that parts are terrified of God. In fact, God is why they're burdened. This is what they believe.
Right.
They don't want to have anything to do with Jesus. And this is in Catholics, right? That are going to mass, daily mass, praying every day. We have these parts that are terrified. Huh. And so if the self can love the part, that can be like St. Paul, the milk, right? Huh. Having Jesus there would be like the meat, the steak, the potatoes. They can't take that in. If the self, the innermost self, is loving the part, that is coming from God. All love comes from God. But so often they have to have that internal attachment, that attachment figure that they can feel secure enough so that even if they're terrified of God, there's enough trust in the self that the self might be able to eventually introduce them to Jesus.
Wow.
I also tend to work not necessarily with Jesus, but with whatever, when I'm working with a part, with whoever might be acceptable to that part. It might be the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother Mary, might be the guardian angel. A lot of rape victims. They want somebody to connect with somebody who doesn't have a body, right? So the guardian angel becomes much safer, or the Holy Spirit becomes safer than Jesus because he's got a body. So these are the parts that I really want to reach out to, because they're the ones that are never going to show up at the table if Jesus is already there.
Wow.
Aren't there also parts that aren't going to show up if I'm there? That is, people who have a serious fear of their own self-hatred. Or is that a part and not the core?
Well, I would say that they would fear a part, but most of the time, so this is the other thing. Most of the time, most people are blended.
What does that mean?
So what does that mean? That means taken over by a part.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you kind of think about this from, say, Inside Out, the Pixar movie Inside Out, where, anger takes over the control panel, for the vast majority of people, the vast majority of time, a part is driving the bus. They're actually not recollected in the natural realm. They're actually not being led and guided by their innermost self. This is an effect of original sin. It's the effect of sins of others. It's the effect of our own personal sins. This fragmentation, and then a part leaps into that seat because it feels like otherwise it's rudderless, driverless, and so again, trying to help. So when I look at this, I think the first thing is to see if we can get the parts to unblend from the self, so that the self can be there as your innermost self is. And that's a new experience for parts most of the time. That's a brand new experience. That is like, whoa, who is this? I've never met this person. Most of the time, parts, when you start doing this work, they don't believe the self exists.
Right.
And if they do believe there's a self that exists, they associate it with whichever part has been most blended, the primary manager part that has been most blended with the self.
Wow.
And so to see that primary manager come out of the self and sit next to the self, and that the self is not that primary manager, not that critic, who is always riding all the other parts, not that Catholic standard bearer that was always saying you're not good enough, we're not doing enough, we're not gonna be able to earn the love of God. That's the heresy of Pelagianism, right? Yes. Every part, when they're not in right relationship to self, has a heresy. At least one. Wow. So, and I'm a psychologist, right? I'm very hesitant to, bring Jesus in and expect him to perform according to my script. I really want this to happen internally first, so that there can be a much better connection to Christ in a little later, once the parts are a little bit more. And I tend to work with them one at a time. I don't tend to try to find a way to work with 12 parts all at once.
Yeah. Chaos. It can be chaos. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a little bit more personal, but I do believe ultimately, right, that the self is not the savior. This is one of the problems with internal family systems. Basically, they say two things that are really problematic from a Catholic point of view. One is that the self is the soul, which it's not. And the second is that basically the self is the one who's going to save. And we need to be really clear about that when we start bringing these approaches in, so that we make the appropriate anthropological adjustments, if you will, in the practice using them. So,
Peter, can you talk we're talking about self. How would somebody know what's the self and what's a blended part? How do you know the difference?
Sure. So let's just kind of get into some definitions. Those that listen to my podcast know how into definitions I am. So that we know what we're talking about. So I'm just going to give you a definition of the self from an IFS perspective. And that is the core of the person, the center of the person. This is who we sense ourselves to be in our best moments, when our self is free, unblended from any of our parts, governing our whole being as an active, compassionate leader. IFS will refer to the self as the seat of consciousness. And the self has these 8 characteristics, these 8 C's. The self is calm, curious, compassionate, confident, courageous. It has clarity, connectedness, and creativity. The other thing is the self is not motivated by fear. Parts, when they blend, are always motivated by fear. They grab onto an agenda because of fear. The self is motivated by love.
Wow.
And that's very different. And you can have what we call self-like manager parts. These are parts that imitate the self, but there's always something missing. There's always a little tell that you can find because they're not primarily interested in the highest good of the part. They're pursuing their agenda to try to save the system, often at the expense of the parts.
Wow.
They're willing to sacrifice a part, to throw a part under the bus in order to save the rest of the self. Right? So
I just want to summarize. There's the 8 C's, and yeah, we can sit with that. But man, for me, that one criteria, motivated by fear, that is such a fast discernment for me because the self-aware, I'm self-aware enough to know when I'm operating out of fear. And I have a lot of other areas that I'm not self-aware, but that is so helpful to go, right. And the other one you said, who am I in my best moments? That's and I actually somatically felt like a lightning when you said that. And I went, oh man, wouldn't that be nice to live from that space primarily most of the time instead of apart? But yeah, this is just good news.
Well, you tapped into another tell, right? And that is, what does my body feel like when I'm in self? And people will have a sense of warmth inside, or light inside, or expansiveness, inside. So some have a definite body correlate to that somatic experience that helps them to know that they're in self.
So let me ground this back in Catholic theology, which I know you've done a lot of work on this, so that the true self is the self created by God before original sin. Would that be accurate?
Well, I have a couple of objections that come up right away. First of all, I never like the language of the true self versus the false self.
Okay.
Because these parts are also true. I think it has a way of devaluing the parts, and we need our parts. So I tend to shy away from true self, false self. That came out of some of the self-psychology stuff in the 70s, Heinz Kohut and those guys. And I would also say, I don't know a lot about like what happened before the fall. I know there was a perfect harmony. I know that the different entities within the parts in the self have different roles. I would be careful about like putting them in a hierarchy of value, because I go back to St. Paul, like, can the heart say, or can the hand say to the eye, I do not need you? They're all needed. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I had a part just to react to the true self thing, so
I may be coming out of a part two here. So
yeah.
I don't know.
It's happening, people.
just kind of press this a little bit. I understand the fall as being the movement from wholeness to fragmentation.
Right. I agree with that.
And I would say that God created us good, and that unlike some forms of Protestantism, Luther's belief that we're dung covered by snow, that the Catholic view is that we maintain that core of goodness, even when there are places where we reject God and lose salvation. There's a core of goodness that we can always come back to. Conscience is part of that. But what I'm hearing you describe is something more than conscience. It's a sense of self that is untainted by fear or sin. And so it sounds like freedom, a place where there's still a part of us that's still in freedom and not in bondage or slavery to sin or fear or anything else. Is that all accurate?
Boy, you're into really deep theological waters, Bob, and you probably know this better than I do. The short, honest answer is I don't know if that would be technically correct. My sense of it is, the way that I operate is that the self can experience fear and can experience these things through the parts primarily. I do believe that the self is ontologically good, essentially good in its essence, but I also believe the parts are good in their essence too. People have asked me, how do you differentiate between the spirit and the flesh? in the Pauline sense,
Mm-hmm.
because there can be this sort of condemnation of the flesh. And, I don't have to be honest, I don't have a good ready answer for that. That's why I'm so glad that Christian Amalu is doing this dissertation. That's why I'm glad that, Jerry Crete, my partner at Souls and Hearts, is writing a book on IFS, really grounding that in a Catholic understanding of the human person.
Wow.
So I think there's some of these areas that we're still really needing to flesh out and explore. And fortunately, we're now starting to get a few philosophers and theologians that really want to kind of dive into this with us. It's been a huge kind of divide, right? Some of the times some of the clients that I've had the most difficulty doing this have been those with advanced degrees in philosophy and theology, because they can get really in their head, really in their head, and have trouble with the experiential aspect of it. So I really am hoping that we can bring together people from all kinds of disciplines, philosophy, theology, psychology, counseling, social work, pastoral care, that can come together to be able to flesh some of these questions out a little more deeply. Because I would love to know the answer more definitively than I can share with you.
Yeah, we're getting into waters that maybe even the greatest theologians and philosophers, they might not even be able to answer. And I think that's something that a nuance, I think for those of us that have parts that just go, it's not 100% guaranteed, I'm out, because that again would be operating out of fear. I think that we know enough that you can navigate into it and not contradict or compromise what we do know to be true about the human person. And at some point, we will step, you eventually have to step into gray area, but because you just don't know, eventually it will be gray, and there's an entrustment to God. I'm pursuing the good, and if I'm off by a degree or two here, please correct me and right straight with my crooked pursuit. But when I go back to the practical lived experience of it, I would say, if we could say generically, we all have the distinction between true self and parts. And what I'm hearing is it could be that there were parts pre-fall.
Oh, I would assume there were. Yeah. Oh, and yeah, I totally believe that. I believe we saw Jesus's parts in the Garden of Gethsemane. When he says, "Take this cup from me, but not my will be done, but thine."
Right.
He's reacting in his humanity. St. Paul tells us he's like us in all things but sin, right?
Right.
That would include that multiplicity,
right,
that we were talking about. I think those parts existed pre-fall. Absolutely.
But they would be completely integrated.
They would have been completely integrated pre-fall. Yeah. On the natural level. Yeah.
There's where I think I appreciate what just happened there, because that to me is the unification that's solid enough to move forward in the, I need to work through my garbage and and the parts of me that are, all over the place. I don't want to avoid the true self, but gosh, sorry, listeners, I've got like 6 ideas on the ticker tape of the computer screen of my mind right now. So I'm trying to simplify this. The difference between true self and false self, that was a big turning point for me, because I was saying, oh, my false self. And I did a little bit of homework and reflection and went, hang on. I came to the exact same conclusion as you, Peter. Those parts of me are true. They're actually there. I wish they weren't, but they're actually there. So false isn't the right word. And I've come to say like a wounded self or a broken self, etc. Can we go to the concept now of blended? Because I think maybe right there, people would find it really hard. Because if you're blended and you call that normal, how the heck do you know what's not blended? How would you know if you're blended? And maybe I'm flipping the coin over from true self. And now, it's probably one and the same thing. But how does somebody know if they're blended? Is it just as obvious as, oh, I'm living in fear? Or is there other ways?
So I would just start by assuming you're blended.
Okay, that's a good start.
I would just start by getting curious and asking the question, if you're not experiencing calm, curiosity, compassion, confidence, courage, clarity, connectedness, creativity, if you're not like in that space, what people might consider, sort of just really centered, really recollected, then assume you're blended. Okay. And then the question becomes, how am I blended? Yeah. Or with what part am I blended? if we frame the question properly and we're seeking that question, we're going to find. We're going to find. We have that in good authority. Yeah. So, then I would just begin to open a dialogue. And remember, the blending, I want to be really clear about this. It's not a dichotomy. It's not black and white. It's not all blended, no blended. There's a continuum here.
Nice. That
you can be blended on. And so if you can get a little space to be able to observe yourself, then we know that some IFS would say some self is present, or I would say there's some recollection present, some capacity to observe the self. If you don't have the capacity to observe yourself and you're like, this is just how it is, then you're so blended, you're completely blended. You don't have that capacity for self-observation.
Wow.
But if you have a capacity for self-observation, then that opens the possibility that the innermost self can begin to observe and connect. And so you can ask the question, why am I, or why are you so anxious right now? I would just begin by opening a dialogue, with the part that you presume is there, and see if the part responds to it. Yeah. Parts do want to be known. They want to be understood. They want to be heard. They want to be seen by the innermost self, even if they're not convinced the innermost self exists. Right. And if they don't have that, they'll seek a counterfeit. They'll seek a self somewhere else. They'll seek it in another person, a romantic partner. They'll seek it in, a coach, a teacher. They'll seek it elsewhere, or they'll seek it in a part of you that has taken over and maybe has some goodness that it's connecting to from the self, but it's a self-like manager part. We want to be able to see if we can just invite parts to step back. So I do this a lot. I'll say, would you be willing to just give me a little more space so I can see you? Would you be willing to give me a little more space so that we can have a relationship?
Wow.
Because if we're fused, if we're blended, there's no potential for relationship. But if you can give me a little space, I can see you, I can hear you, we can begin to connect. And when parts begin to taste that, they really like it. They really like it because they're our parts are made for relationship. We're made for relationship. That includes our parts. We're not made to just take over and blend and play king of the mountain with all the other parts and, try to drive the bus on our own, right? Yeah. That's exhausting. Parts know they can't really do it very effectively. So it's about creating that space. That's what those experiential exercises that I was talking about that we do in the Interior Integration for Catholics podcast, and then in the Resilient Catholics community, and also in the ITC, the Interior Therapist community. So much of our work is really the experiential exercises. So again, you can't think your way there. It's not like algebra where you can solve the problem and then it's like, bing, then it resolves. This is, and really ultimately what it comes down to is love. Can the parts sense that they are loved by the self?
Yeah. Just a couple of thoughts, and then I want to ask you a question. One thought is,
sure.
What I have found in this work is understanding God's mercy and internalizing that towards each of the parts is really critical for healing, because if we're staying in a place of self-hatred or self-condemnation from any part, or we believe that God is condemning us in those places, then those parts are going to hide. They're not going to come forward. So it's the love and mercy and compassion for those parts that allows the healing and integration to take place. And it's the self-hatred and the shame and the self-criticism that pushes those parts out. Is that an accurate understanding?
I would say, yes, I would nuance it a little bit by saying it's the parts that carry the self-hatred that get banished.
Oh.
So if you think about parts that are trying to save as much of the self system as possible, they're the ones driving the parts that carry the shame and the rage and the grief away. So these are not existing. I don't think the shame and rage and grief and the other things that get the fear, I don't think that exists not in association with a part. I don't think there's such thing as a free-floating rage or a free-floating grief. They're all associated with a part. The part's burdened with that. And so when that gets banished, when that gets pushed out, it's by the protectors that are trying to save us from being overwhelmed. And frankly, that's important, but they don't know another way. And so we're trying to introduce them another way. But I think I'm getting away from what you were asking, Bob.
So is self-hatred a protector then?
Self-hatred can be, but it can also be an exile.
Okay.
Right. And I believe that most people actually have a pretty high level of self-hatred. They just may not be aware of it. And anytime we sin, it's an act of hatred against ourselves. It's an act of harm against ourselves. That doesn't mean that there has to be malice, but yeah, because parts of us believe that other parts of us are keeping us from what's good, true, and beautiful, are keeping us from God. It's so easy for a part of us to hate another part that has impulses toward lust, or has impulses toward, whatever concupiscent, tendency the part has. But those are ways that parts are trying to find something good. St. Thomas Aquinas says we're always seeking at least a perceived good.
Yes.
It might not be ordered properly in the hierarchy of goods, or it might not be ordered to what we need in that moment. That's what makes it sinful. Yeah. But if we can recognize that parts aren't just malicious, or they're not just evil, that they're seeking a good, then we can open up possibilities for finding that good in another way. If we just banish them, it's like pulling the fuses on the dashboard that lit up the engine lights. The different, if you think about these as symptoms, right? Like kind of like the lights on a dash. And we're all old enough back in the day. If you knew which fuses to pull, you could kill the lights on the dash, right? But you didn't solve the underlying problem. If that engine's going to throw a rod in 20 miles, you didn't fix it by shutting down your dash lights, right? Yes. So, so we want to be able to listen to that and actually to be able to heal at a fundamental core level. It's another beautiful thing about IFS is that it's not about symptom management. So many therapies have just gotten into this place where we're resigned to symptom management. It's about actually healing.
Yes. Yes. Peter, two questions, and I think the second one will start to land our plane on our time. So the first one, where do parts come from? I think some of the psychological perspective might be, I had a traumatic experience and a part of me carries that trauma and broke off from the original whole of me. Or is there another theory there about, was I born with 20 different parts? Like, where do parts come from? That's question number one. And then question two, for the people out there who are listening to this podcast and are like, what in the world are these guys talking about? And parts and what? And if it's just so brand new, are there places people can go to get very basic, simple orientation to what this stuff is and where it goes? So where do parts come from? What do we go for basics?
So the position of Richard Schuchts, the way he words it, it's so interesting. He says that all of our parts are present at birth.
Okay.
All right. So that's in contradiction to early trauma therapists and theorists who are working with multiple personality disorder. That's what it was called back in the day, dissociative identity disorder now. It seemed like the trauma manufactured parts. What IFS would say is that didn't happen, that there were no parts manufactured, but parts were pulled into extreme roles as a function of the trauma.
Okay.
So you have all your jazz musicians when you're born.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Yep.
But when the trauma happened, your trumpet player had to carry the shame and be banished out in the woods.
Got it.
Okay. And so he's no longer able to contribute to the music because he's got his own. And then your trombonist had to guard the door so that the trumpet player wouldn't come in with all that shame.
Okay.
So he can't play the role that he was called to too, Wow. And so the idea was that's in contradistinction to, where a lot of trauma therapists were back in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, where they were saying, there was a single unitary homogeneous personality, and then it got shattered into all these parts.
Yes.
All right. So there's a major paradigm shift. I think that idea of multiplicity and the idea of systems taking inside that these parts and the innermost self form a system, those are two huge contributions that are going to have as great an impact on psychology as Freud's popularization of the unconscious did 100 years ago. Where to find out more about it? So episode 71 of my podcast, Interior Integration for Catholics, is an introduction to internal family systems.
Nice.
And you can find that on all the podcast players, Interior Integration for Catholics. Episode 73 is an episode called Is Internal Family Systems Really Catholic? And so I go through a whole series about looking at that. If folks want to know more, there's a lot in Interior Integration for Catholics, starting with episode 37, which is where I started to really focus on more IFS themes. Mm-hmm. And that carries all the way through to 105. We're on episode 105 now. Wow. And then also the weekly reflections. You can sign up for those at soulsandhearts.com. On our main page, it says there's a blue button that says Get Dr. Peter's Weekly Email Reflections. You can get those. And then if you go into the archive, that's at soulsandhearts.com/blog.
Wonderful.
Those are going to all be grounded in a Catholic anthropology. If you want just basic books on IFS, there are a bunch of them that are put out by the IFS Institute by Richard Schuchts. Okay. One of them is an introduction to internal family systems. It's pretty basic. Okay. And there's others as well.
Yeah, I love that. Episode 71 of Interior Integration for Catholics, that podcast, that is super helpful, because what I would discourage, and maybe you have a different theory, I would discourage a neophyte jumping into Richard Schuchts if they don't have a sound Catholic anthropology, because he can be persuasive. If you don't have an original framework to compare something to, that's why the work that you're doing is so valuable, because those of us who limp into this stuff, we get to borrow from all the hard work you've done of maintaining a Catholic anthropology and integrating a healing understanding, I guess. So I'd really encourage listeners to check out episode 71, it sounds, in 73. And then if you want to dive deeper, the whole podcast is there. Mm-hmm. That's super helpful. Bob, final thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to express appreciation, Peter. It's I just feel the brotherhood of our journeys, even though they've been in different directions, just the heart of your desire to fully integrate your faith into the practice, and at the same time not to compromise anything.
Amen.
In helping people heal in that process, and just been a delight getting to know you. And now that I know about your podcast, I'll be listening to some of those too.
Well, thank you, Bob. It's been a pleasure to be with you. I certainly support. It's a relatively small group of us that are out there in the human formation aspect of this. It's a relatively small group. It's primarily led by lay people. It's getting more traction now, especially with the program for priestly formation, version 6. There's another, kind of iteration of that, primarily focused on seminarians, but emphasizes human formation. So I think this is going to be much bigger as time goes on. Greater realization that human formation needs are so important.
Yeah. Peter, thanks so much for being with us. We will have listeners, we will have all of these things that Peter mentioned, the links all in the show notes, episode 71, all those things we will have in the show notes, so we'll do that work for you. And please go and check out the stuff that Peter's doing. This, I can say for me, like if you're a faithful listener of Restore the Glory, I am going to go and dive into this stuff. And so that's my future. And so there's so much good that is here. I just can't bless it enough. So Peter, thank you for the niche in the kingdom that you are offering to us. It's just wonderful. Thank you for your yes, and thanks for being with us. Listeners, we are appreciative of you, and we will continue on in our series with the 3 primary relationships next time. God bless you, and we'll talk to you again soon.